Hey everybody, how you doing? It's your boy coming to you for another segment of Toolbox Tuesday. It is Tuesday, June 8th, 2021, and I am continuing my theme of pride for this month's Toolbox Tuesday. And today I will be discussing mental and physical challenges that are faced specifically by people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, or intersex. But before I get to any of that, I will start off by discussing some of the stuff that I talked about in last week's segment as a little recap, in case some of y'all weren't paying attention or you fell asleep or, I don't know, you're just picking up on this one and you have no intentions on going back. Last week, I started off by talking about some of the biological, physiological, and environmental considerations that impact where we as individuals fall on the gender and sexual affectional orientation spectrum. So I discussed the theory of the gendered brain, in which there were actual differences observed in the brains of people who were heterosexual and cissexual, in both men and women, male and female. And then there were also differences observed in people who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, across, the spectrum, across the variance. And so what this led us to believe scientifically is that the brains of different genders and the brains of people who have varying sexual and affectional orientations are different, meaning people who are queer are built differently. People who are transgender are built differently. People who are lesbian are built differently from people who are heterosexual or cissexual. Today, I'm going to introduce to you the idea of gender and sexual minorities. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the experiences that we encounter across our lifespan and how that impacts us, how we develop, how we view the world, how we build relationships, and how illness manifests in us, both mental illness and physical illness. So, right from the cuff, what you have to understand is that people who are queer almost always experience some form of physical violence or emotional violence or abuse. So for those of you who are clinical providers out there, think back to what you know about the ACEs study, or the study that discusses the impact of aversive childhood experiences. Y'all probably remember that survey. What happens to a child or an adolescent who experiences physical, emotional, mental abuse during development? Definitely leads to the emergence of some maladaptive coping styles, some disordered personalities, and a whole other host or list of disorders or things that have to be treated. In addition to physical and emotional abuse, people who are queer also experience, are at an increased risk for substance abuse, suicide, suicidal ideation, non-suicidal self-injury, risky sex, which also means an increased risk for STIs, also an increased risk for depression, an increase for anxiety, increased risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, increase of interpersonal difficulties in relationships, friendships, at work, low self-esteem, increased risk for homelessness, overeating, all things that could definitely impact the wellness or the experience of any queer person who comes to your office seeking therapy. And if you want to understand etiologies that lead to these physical and mental issues, one of the things that you could research is the minority stress model. The sexual minority stress model discusses the ongoing conflict between sexual minority values and the values of the dominant, values or people. So in plain language, the values that people who are queer hold versus the values of people who are heterosexual hold. When those conflict, the stress that creates leads to the emergence of illness. Mental illness, physical illness, leads to the emergence of conditions that will exacerbate any kind of genetic predisposition to any illness that was already present, right? So think about it like this. Someone who considers themselves queer, someone who's a queer, is experiencing work stress because of that identity. Well, that experience is like 2 times more likely, literally 2 times more likely, according to studies, to make a mental illness fire. So if me as a queer person is predisposed to depression or anxiety, well, the conditions that are created by a stress environment due to my sexual identity will make those symptoms occur. And now I have that battle. So some of the issues or illnesses that are faced by people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, plus include issues of the gut and digestion, depression, anxiety, risky sex, substance abuse and polysubstance abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidality, and a series of unstable relationships. So gut and digestive issues are definitely related to symptoms and experiences with anxiety. However, because gut and digestive issues can also be made worse by the symptom of overeating or undereating that comes with anxiety and depression, this is an example of how some socio-political, mental, emotional issues make physical things, actual physical, recognizable, discernible issues in our body a lot worse. Stress-induced ulcers become something that people who are struggling with gender-based violence or gender-based discrimination or sexual orientation-based discrimination become at risk for. So from the get-go, considering the earliest parts of development, let's take an example, a child who emerges as noticeably queer or gender non-conforming to their parents and to the caregivers around them. Well, that alone ignites a powder keg of treatment of this child based on their gender or sexual orientation nonconformity. So this means that there is the possibility of the emergence of microaggressions in the home. Parents who call their children faggots or little bitches, or parents who refer to their children in demeaning or invalidating terms specifically for observations about gender nonconformity. These things have an impact on self-esteem, and they have an impact on the tools that a child can use to feel safe, strong, and secure. So imagine the implications of having your caregivers deride you or remove aspects of safety from your home life. Well, now the child has to learn how to love, thrive, and be successful in an environment that is inherently dangerous. Can you, as a provider, imagine what kind of coping skills or what kind of personality mechanisms a child might have to develop in order to be okay in that environment? Moving outside the home, where people who appear visually gender non-conforming or who appear to be some kind of dynamic sexual orientation, and consider the treatment of them when they go to school or when they're in the supermarket or when they're seeking health care. Because the thing that folks don't understand when considering these things is that there is a weird social undercurrent that people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, who are somehow gender nonconforming, are acceptable targets for violence and maltreatment. So the emotional instability of security that was stretched out at home is now met in school, potentially by teachers, definitely by classmates. And so this too impacts how a child can develop and where they can identify their place in the world, or how they can identify their place in the world. This also impacts how a child determines what parts of themselves become known to other people. What do they show to others to build relationships? What do they show to others to get their needs met? All impacted by the way that society responds to their obvious gender nonconformity. Moving out of childhood, moving out of adolescence, the same issues continued to be perpetuated across lifespan. So now we're in the workplace, and there are other various forms of discrimination based on gender nonconformity or sexual orientation, physical touching in the workplace, having to put up with sometimes very sexual harassment from coworkers, from supervisors, from people above supervisors, leading people to understand very continually that there isn't necessarily a safe place or a special place that can uphold or protect a very different identity. So if there is no safe place for your client or your patient or your child who identifies as queer, how are they meant to support themselves? How are we meant to build our relationships? What skills do we use to reach out to other people, to build love, to experience trust? It was very recently that homosexuality was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual as an actual diagnosis. Meaning in the DSM-3, you could still be diagnosed as having a mental illness for being lesbian, gay, bisexual. Not even going to mention the treatment of people who are transgender in that book. But all this to say that when there is no safe place for you to go, the only option for thriving and surviving means that you've got to get very, very creative with the resources around you. You've got to get really creative with your emotions. You've got to get really creative with your cognitions, or the way you think about things. You've got to get really creative with the way that you approach other people. You've got to get really creative with so backing up for a second and considering the way that people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender get treated in the healthcare field. So how do doctors treat us? Taking that into consideration means that we now also have to be very creative about how we get medicine, how we medicate ourselves, or how we treat ourselves for the various illnesses that we know are wrong with us, but we can't seem to get adequate help for. So that's where the self-medicating and the substance abuse that queers are so at risk for comes in at. Substances are fun. They are dope. Pun intended. People use them because they make us feel good. And if you feel fucked up all the time because the world hates you because of who you are and substances around, all of a sudden that seems like a real good idea. You can validate that as a therapist. You can be like, all right, fine, I understand where cocaine started to seem like a good idea. You can say that without endorsing the fact that cocaine is like good for them. It's not good for us. We know, right? It can be fun. It does the dopamine thing in the brain. But as a therapist, you do have a responsibility to understand why that seemed like a reasonable place to turn and provide a place of hope and support that change is possible because there are other more functional, more fulfilling ways to treat oneself. Consider that the compassion that you give as a healthcare provider might very well be the catalyst that leads to a cycle of healthy choices that are based on compassion, that are based on wellness, that are based on transcendence. What are the symptoms of depression? Well, when it comes to depression for people who are somehow queer, it's important to understand that it's not just depression. It's not major depressive disorder. It's not depressive disorder unspecified. Consider the fact that identity is a lifelong thing, and the stigma for a lot of people has been lifelong. That means that you might have to consider realistically treating someone for symptoms related to dysthymia as opposed to a major depressive episode that has remitted or may remit. But as long as the conditions for the depression last, i.e. the bastardized or stigmatized identity, the longer you're going to have to engage in treatment for the symptoms that arise because of that. So take a look at dysthymia. Consider mood dysregulation and what it means to struggle with regulating your mood in different environments. Moving from maybe an environment that is built of family of choice and then into an environment that is built of people who are invalidating, and the struggle that might occur from shifting or regulating the mood, going from feeling comfortable or safe and then into an environment of hostility and torment. Also consider the traditional, more widespread symptoms of depression that include excessive weight loss or weight gain, anhedonia, the sleep disturbances, absolutely. Also psychomotor disturbances can also utilize those. Feelings of worthlessness are likely to come up in comparisons or evaluations of oneself in reference to the queer community at large. So someone might not be describing themselves or evaluating themselves according to heteronormative perspectives. They might be utilizing specifically queer perspectives to compare themselves to. And so you might have to educate yourself on some cultural themes and some cultural occurrences that might let you know when an evaluation of oneself is unreasonably negative or represents a healthy kind of move towards self-improvement. Feelings of worthlessness could also be tied to performance in romantic relationships and core beliefs that queer people are only the good kind of queer if they can fit the heteronormative view of substantial relationships. So that's also something that you can look out for, and when you're kind of trying to look for whether or not someone is experiencing depression, or like if something that they're talking about kind of meets that criteria. There's also the diminished concentration and the increased fatigue that are standard in depressive disorders. When it comes to anxiety and when it comes to PTSD, you also have to think very dynamically. For someone who experiences very limited safety because of what their identity is, or because of what someone assumes their identity is, what is likely to trigger that response in the nervous system? What is likely to trigger the fight or flight response in someone who is queer? And what might that look like? Not just anxiety disorder. Consider that there's selective mutism, right? If I can't speak or don't speak, maybe no one will be able to tell that I'm gay because my voice is like this. Consider the role that plays in selective mutism as an anxiety disorder. Consider the development of phobias, not going to specific places or not going around specific people, or being triggered by specific images, like specific flags that encourage hate. Consider social phobia as something that you have to assess for in someone who is on the gender or sexual affectional orientation spectrum, who's not heterosexual or cissexual. Consider derealization and depersonalization as symptoms that people who are transgender might be talking about, as in, I don't feel trans, or I don't feel attached or connected to my body, or I don't feel real. Very common among people who are transgender. When it comes to, also anxiety, abdominal pains and distress, like super common as well, can't forget about that one. Symptoms of PTSD, intrusive thoughts or experiences like dreams, flashbacks, and persistent avoidance of triggers and stimuli. So not going near stores or landmarks where violence occurred. So queers are still getting bashed. Avoiding those places can be a sign that post-traumatic stress disorder is forming, depending on how long ago the bashing occurred. Right? Like, we still call it queer bashing or gay bashing when someone who is a queer gets physically assaulted in public or in private for that identity. It still happens. By the way, I want to say it is 45% of gay people. It is 65% of lesbians. It is 45% of bisexuals. And I can't even give you a number of how many people who identify as transgender have been the victims of actual physical violence in the community or in their own homes. So when you consider that you have someone who is coming to you for healing and support, definitely make sure you do a thorough assessment for PTSD and acute stress disorder. That way you can make appropriate rule-outs as well, and this will help you select appropriate interventions. But back to the symptoms of PTSD. So there are the negative alterations of the cognitions related to stressful, painful, or traumatic events. So forgetting details that have happened, while maybe other witnesses are like, oh no, this thing also happened, remember? And like maybe your patient are like, nope, I don't remember that. Right? Like that's an example of a negative alteration to a cognition. And then there's also the exaggerated like jump responses. So if you think about people who like jump with the loud noises or the bangs, or who struggle during like the 4th of July or during the expectation of fireworks or loud bangs. Like think 21 gun salute, right? Like that's the exaggerated jump response that is typical of people who do have post-traumatic stress disorder. And so consider the very real reality that almost anyone who comes into your practice who identifies as a lesbian, who identifies as gay, as bisexual, as transgender, intersex, queer, questioning, asexual, pansexual, any of these non-heterosexual identifiers has likely experienced some kind of assault on their person or on their identity that is really like your way in. You can start to talk about that in an easy and realistic way by just acknowledging that it's likely that it happened, and not trying to force anyone into a courtroom or to justify whether or not they actually experienced an injury based on their sexual or gender orientation. And just recognize the people that you are working with know what happens to them. Just like you as a person know when someone assaults or insults you, so do our patients, so do we. So when we come to you and tell you that, and then you turn it around and make it feel a little victim blamey, or if we have to sit on your couch and explain to you why something that happened to us was inappropriate, it certainly does not deepen the rapport. And as you know, rapport is everything. So that can be an example of how you check yourself. When it comes to substance abuse and polysubstance abuse, that really can be an indication that someone is struggling really, really hard, and they've been doing it for really, really long. So consider polysubstance abuse as someone who will find anything and use anything to change their mood and their mind, to kind of get that temporary relief from reality. So this could be someone who wakes up, uses beer and weed, moves directly into cocaine, has some heroin at lunchtime, wakes up from that nod, moves into some methamphetamines, then also gets back in with the drinking buddies at nighttime, and then so on and so forth. Like, actually, the combination of designer or natural drugs, of pharmaceuticals, or things that can be utilized as a way of self-medicating are actually endless. So you will have to be creative about the questions that you ask, because sometimes people who identify as queer also don't trust healthcare providers. So you might not get a legit answer the first few times you ask about substance use, or the first few times you ask about suicidality, or the first few times you ask about the desire to actually fight other people in the community. That distrust may definitely lead to some altered answers until we kind of feel you out a little bit, until we are safe and secure in the rapport and we understand that confidentiality really does mean confidentiality. So understand also that if you don't know any queer people in real life, you are really, really, really going to struggle with working with them professionally. You might think you're the shit when you do it. However, we all understand and know real quickly if you don't know any queers in real life, or if you don't take them seriously. So definitely make sure that you are on your P's and Q's take a look out for some resources. Go back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and take a look at where that pyramid is disrupted for lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgenders, otherwise queer people. Take a look at how society disrupts that hierarchy of needs and use that to help you design your interventions for them. That's all I got for y'all today. Next week, I'm going to talk about identity development and coming out, so come on back for that. Thanks for joining me.